to start tonight with something that I not so modestly think is a heroic task. It's not as heroic as what all you are doing right now and all the challenges you're facing, but it is still a challenge, and that is to rescue the Articles of Confederation from the dustbin of history. I don't know if there's any more important document in American history that's as disparaged as the Articles of Confederation. So tonight we're gonna give the Articles a big, collective hug. We're gonna put them in the limelight, and I'm gonna try my best not to use a couple of words. And one of those words is weak. That's how the Articles is usually described, and they're also described as a failure. And I'm going to try to suggest something quite different, that actually the Articles were something of a mad success on their own terms. And if they did fail, it might have actually been because they were too strong, or at least they created the conditions for state governments to be too strong in the early republic. And so this task is not easy because the Articles, of course, live in the shadows of the shadow of the U.S. Constitution. And this is this famous image of the Philadelphia Convention in the summer of 1787. And there's a reason that we celebrate the Constitution. It's the oldest continuous national written constitution in the world. The oldest continuous constitution is actually the state constitution of Massachusetts, and it it's served us quite well. And so it's just natural, I think, to compare the Constitution to the Articles and to just assume that the Constitution was going to happen. But if any of you have heard my talks before, you know that I use a dirty word, or I introduce a dirty word, and I think it's the dirtiest word in history. And it's so dirty, it has 10 letters, not just 4. And the word is inevitable. Inevitable. We don't want to think that things are inevitable in history, because as soon as we do that, we really kind of take away the whole purpose of studying history with students, where we want to pose questions about how and why different things happen, and to think about other possible outcomes. So we're going to try to remove the idea for most of this talk that the Constitution is coming, and we're going to try to assess the Articles on their own terms. I think it shows something about the disrespect of the Articles, that most Americans have no idea who actually wrote these things. Unlike the Constitution, where we have James Madison, the father of the Constitution. Well, the father of the Articles of Confederation was John Dickinson. John Dickinson was a prominent politician from Philadelphia. He actually had the second most read pamphlet in the years leading up to the American Revolutionary War, right after Common Sense. He had letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. He wasn't a farmer at all. He was a lawyer, so you can see that he's a smart guy already. He knew that Americans would want to hear advice from a farmer, but not a lawyer. And for any fans of the musical 1776, which I adore, John Dickinson is the great villain because he's holding out throughout the Second Continental Congress from signing the Declaration of Independence. And he actually never signed it, but he was a patriot, American patriot, and he went on to fight for the American cause. And so Dickinson initially had rather, large ambitions for this document. He actually had some early ideas of what were fleshed out in the Constitution in terms of sharing power between the national government and the state government, what we call federalism. But it was very hard to do anything like that, to pass anything like that in the middle of a war. And the Articles were put together in the middle of a war. And if you read them before this session, you might have noticed something kind of funny that says that the date on them is 1781. But in reality, they'd really been using this system going all the way back to 1775 and 1776. It took all the way to 1781 to actually ratify them because the states didn't trust each other very much. And some states claimed enormous Western lands that other states thought they had to give up before they would enter into this confederation. And so this is the first map of the United States done by an American. And I think it'd be a fun document to share with students, because you can look at just how long states like Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia were. And it's kind of hard to see, but on top of Virginia, Little Connecticut is stretching all the way into the Great Lakes region. And to this day, there's areas of Ohio that are actually named after this. They're called the Western Reserve because that was Connecticut's Western Reserve. There's Case Western University, which was connected to the first presidential debate, and you probably heard that term. Well, anyways, they had to get past this problem, which they eventually did. The articles were ratified, and so we're going to look at what's actually in this document, and I'm going to avoid the word weakness. We're going to look at the limits of the Articles of Confederation. And so these are essential things to explain to students because it's so different than the current Constitution. Congress lacked the power to collect taxes, to regulate interstate trade. There was no executive, no real president. There's a person that's called the president of Congress, but they're not the actual president of the country. There was no national judiciary, no national currency. And it was very hard to get things done under the Articles of Confederation. It took 9 states to agree to anything of real significance, and to amend the Articles took all 13. And so in some ways that kind of doomed the document because it was so hard to change and improve upon. And so it's worth asking the question, why so many limits on the national government? And we have to think about when this document was created. It's in the middle of the American Revolutionary War. The American Revolution was a movement against a very centralized state in Great Britain. And the Americans really wanted to avoid repeating the mistakes of Britain. And they had been claiming all along that their colonies were sovereign, that they had power over their own affairs. And so that's what the Articles of Confederation created. Now, the challenge of this period is that Congress couldn't tax the American people, and there was all kinds of debts to pay off. And you can see that America was quite weak at the time. They still used the British pound system, but you can see the national debt. That's really the debt that was owed to Americans who helped to buy bonds to help fight the Revolutionary War. There was the foreign debt to countries like France and the Netherlands. And then individual states had debts. That's something that actually can't happen now under the Constitution and Alexander Hamilton's financial plan of the 1790s. We just have one national debt. And finally, individuals were in debt. And there was a lot of bankruptcies and foreclosures. So we can think of this as the not so roaring 1780s. And so this is the situation that existed. So what could Congress actually do under the Articles? Well, the most important thing was they could fight a war. They could raise a national army and navy, and that's, of course, what they did. They could conduct the nation's diplomacy, enter into treaties with foreign nations and also Native American tribes. They could regulate the value of coins. They could manage the postal service. This turns out to be a very important function. Aside from the army, the part of the U.S. government that had the most employees, you might say, and the most expenditures was actually the post office. It was a big country, and it took a lot of effort to deliver the mail, and we know that's true to this day. And finally, a really important function of Congress is that they could admit new states and help to resolve various boundary disputes. And so some of these things carried over into the Constitution, particularly the power of Congress to enter in new states to the Union. And that was based on a law that was passed during the Confederation era, the Confederation Congress in 1785. It was proposed by Thomas Jefferson, who actually briefly served in Congress. There's a land ordinance of 1784, and then the famous one is in 1785. And you can see it was very rational. This was the era of the Enlightenment, and it really set up the system by which Western states were settled. Townships were created that were 36 square miles, and settlers could buy acres of land for as little as $1. And this led to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the entry of new states like Ohio, Michigan, Illinois that you can see there. The original Big Ten before it got corrupted by by my local University of Maryland and Rutgers. So the Articles did positive things, or positive things happened under the Articles of Confederation. Now, in studying these and sharing them with students, I think the most important thing to emphasize is that states were sovereign under the Articles. And we'll be looking closely at that specific article in the document. It's Article 2 that provides for that. It says each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. And I think a great way to illustrate this is that the building in which Congress met, the building that we know as Independence Hall, was actually called the Pennsylvania State House at the time. It wasn't called Independence Hall until the early 1820s, when the Marquis de Lafayette, the Frenchman who had supported the American Revolution, came back to America, and he called the building Independence Hall. So even the building where Congress met is called the State House. And so in thinking about the system that this created, I think it's much better to describe this for students as something closer to 13 individual mini countries, republics, that are connected together in a confederation than it is the way we think about the United States today. It's really the difference between thinking about the United States as a singular, the United States is, and that's how we think about it today. When the Articles were created, the United States, the verb that was used was are, the United States are. So it was closer, you might say, to the European Union today, except Brussels actually had more power probably than Philadelphia did in that era. So the way that people reacted to this system of government really depended on their background. And I'm going to divide it into two different camps. A group of historians called the cosmopolitans, or the cosmos. These are the nationalists, and these are people who were highly critical of the Articles of Confederation and thought that the United States needed a stronger national government. And the background of people who were cosmos was much like Alexander Hamilton. They had served in national institutions during the Revolutionary War, either the Continental Congress or even more so, the Continental Army, like Hamilton. And in the Continental Army, they really felt the weakness of the national government because they were always depending on supplies that didn't necessarily come. Now, believe it or not, that was a minority position. If you had a Gallup poll again at this time, there would have been more support for the Articles of Confederation because people appreciated their state governments. They were localists. And I love this. This is an old literature, but for short, we call them locos, the crazies. And this is before Spanish became so prominent in the United States. And I think the sort of uber loco is Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was governor of Virginia. He served briefly in the Virginia militia. And that was the typical person that appreciated the Articles of Confederation, someone who was involved in state government or state affairs or institutions like the militia. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this group and why people liked the Articles, the system that they set up. Every state had its own constitution beginning in 1776. And they were truly revolutionary. They changed the country. Most states had a weak governor and a very strong legislature. This is an image of the Pennsylvania state constitution. It was the most radical of the era. It didn't even have a governor. It had a plural executive of 12 different people. And it also provided near universal white male suffrage. And this was a big deal at the time because what was required to vote under the British system was property. You had to have a certain amount of property. And eventually, the American Revolution, the new United States would abolish that by the 1820s or so. But in some states, the process happened even earlier. In Pennsylvania, in the 14th state, Vermont, there was immediate white male suffrage. And so what happened at the state level is that the legislatures expanded and common people ruled the country to agree that they never have ever since. Lots of farmers, lots of artisans, people that worked with their hands began serving in state legislatures. And as I mentioned, these legislatures are powerful. So a typical person that we might use to think about this system is this guy here, William Finley. Not in the Star Standards, but let me indulge for a minute or two and tell you why I think he's important. He really epitomized this new legislator. He was from Western Pennsylvania, didn't have a college education, was an immigrant from Northern Ireland, and tried all kinds of different jobs in his life. He tried weaving, he tried being a school teacher, a farmer. He didn't do very well really at anything. So I love this. This is a play on that, saying that those who can't do, teach. Well, Finley shows that those who can't teach become politicians. And so he went into politics during the Revolutionary era and really benefited from this expansion of the Pennsylvania legislature during and immediately following the Revolution. And he was proud to actually stick up for common people. There was an idea at the time that if common people got into power, they would just vote their self-interest. And this is why elites like George Washington or Hamilton or James Madison thought they should be in charge. They argued that they were disinterested, meaning that they were not self-interested, that they cared about the common good. But lower class people, they would just try to serve their own self-interest. And Finley really called them on this and said, no, you elites, you are actually serving your own self-interest. And so that's what we're going to do. So when the state legislatures, they passed laws that help common people. They passed laws called stay laws. Those were stays or holds on debts. They passed postponements for taxes, what we'd call today tax holidays. And they printed money. The individual states printed their own money. And when that happens, that benefits debtors, right? Creditors get paid the same number, but the money's worth a lot less because of inflation. And so this really set up something of a class divide between those who liked the Articles of Confederation and those who didn't. When we looked at the localists, let's look at the nationalists for a second. And the person who really, I think, represents the nationalists more than anybody else is George Washington, the namesake of my university. I have to give that disclosure. And of course, he was the commander of the Continental Army and American forces. And so he's always writing to Congress, him and his aides during the war, during winters like at Valley Forge, asking for materials, asking for supplies. And of course, Congress couldn't tax. They could only requisition, which basically meant they could ask nicely, ask the states to provide, things. And of course, that didn't usually happen. So Washington had a real political ideology. We sometimes think of him as above politics, but he was a supporter of a stronger national government, long before the Constitution. And you see that especially in 1783. That's when he famously resigned his commission to Congress. When he did that, King George III said, if this is true, if George Washington has given up power, he'll be the greatest man in the world. And so we remember that correctly. But another thing Washington did during that year in 1783 is he wrote a document in June. It's called the Circular to the States. And he basically excused himself. He said, this is out of place, I know, for a military person, but I have to say that we have to reform our government. So he's on the record as early as 1783 saying that there had to be a stronger, national system. He also felt this economically. Washington's Mount Vernon estate is right along the Potomac River. And Washington had an early case of what we call today Potomac fever. And that's, today we talk about that. People come to Washington and they get, drunk on power. Well, Washington's version of Potomac fever was really exaggerating the commercial potential of the Potomac. He thought the Potomac was key to the entire American future, that this was a river that was going to connect the East with the West, that it would allow for the East to actually begin early forms of industrialization to make various products, because areas in the West could make food. Now, this wasn't a totally crazy idea. This is what happened. You guys probably hear that, and it sounds a lot like the Erie Canal of the 1820s, which linked the Northwest to the East. The problem with the Potomac, as you can see in this painting, there's a few problems. One is it goes west, but it was very hard to connect it to the Ohio River. And that's something that Washington wanted to do. And the other problem is that there's actually waterfalls about 15 miles or so outside of Washington, D.C. today. These are called Potomac Falls. And it was pretty hard to navigate. Washington had to use enslaved labor and servants and just a huge labor force to try to dig canals to get around these waterfalls. So why does all of this matter with the Articles? Well, the Articles, as we talked about, Congress couldn't regulate interstate trade. And so to use the Potomac as a commercial source, Washington had to bring different states together, particularly Maryland and Virginia, the two states where the Potomac flowed. And he did this in 1785 at Mount Vernon in something called the Mount Vernon Conference. And this is important because this is the first time that these elites had gone around the Confederation Congress to get something done. Washington brings the leaders of Maryland and Virginia together to basically say, okay, we're not gonna tax each other. We're not gonna create, tariffs. We're gonna use this commercial, source, and we're gonna use it together and benefit together. And so this is a really important moment because it shows that, okay, well, maybe the Articles can't be fixed. Instead, there has to be end arounds. And that sense grew even more in the fall of 1786 and early 1787 with an event called Sheas Rebellion, which I think all of you teach about. This is an event in which farmers in Western Massachusetts rose up because of all of that debt that I was talking about. Their farms were being foreclosed, and they were led by a Continental Army veteran, a man named Daniel Sheas. So you see on the left here, and one of his lead lieutenants was Job Shattuck. And Sheas had a clever idea. He thought, if you want to prevent a foreclosure, attack the courts. And there weren't digital records, there weren't lots of copies of property deeds, and just prevent the courts from functioning, and then the foreclosure can't happen. Well, this really horrified elites. They thought that this was the complete madness. They were already very frustrated with what was happening in the state level with these different laws that were being passed. And this seemed to prove to them that America really was out of control. And so, I think if we're thinking about the path leading to the Philadelphia Convention, there's a handful of important markers. We have this Mount Vernon Conference that I talked about in March of 1785. Following that, Alexander Hamilton tries to organize the states in another convention. He only gets 5 states to participate. They meet in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786, but they make a really important decision. They decide to have another meeting in Philadelphia in May of 1787. And of course, that will become the Philadelphia Convention. And then in the backdrop of all of this, Sheas Rebellion is happening. And so ultimately, of course, these elites get together and they do away with the Articles of Confederation. And next week, we have an incredibly talented historian, Lori Glover, who's going to talk to us about the Constitution. But I'll just say here in closing that, I mentioned that the Articles had set up this situation where it took 13 to agree to, amend the document. And and in some ways, I think that almost forced this kind of behavior of going around Congress to get these different things done. But even though that was the case, the Philadelphia Convention in May of 1787 initially had the blessing of the Confederation Congress because people like Madison told the leaders of Congress that they were just going to amend the articles, and they weren't going to fully change them. Well, of course, we know that's not what happened. So we're going to keep giving the articles a collective hug by talking about them in our breakout sessions, and we'll try to look at more of the details. But I just want to stress again that they did a couple of things incredibly well. The first was to bring these states together in some type of confederation, in which that would have been quite impossible earlier. Those of you who have been teaching at all about the French and Indian War, you might have looked at Franklin's Albany Plan of Union, Benjamin Franklin's original political cartoon, the first political cartoon in American history. It has that snake that's cut up, and it says, join or die, right? It was always hard to bring these different units together, and the articles did that. And it led to the winning of the war. But as I mentioned, they were almost too strong in the sense that they created these states that probably introduced too much democracy too fast into the United States. But because of that, I think they're actually inspiring for us today and showing how regular people could govern. So I've probably talked for long enough. We really want to hear from all of you about this document. So I'm going to thank you. Thank you for listening, for watching.